Well, first off, I want to thank everybody. Thank you guys for the opportunity to speak today. I've looked at some of the past talks, and I have to admit I'm a little bit intimidated. I even had this discussion with Jess over to follow like scientists and expert in the fields about different aspects of kelp and kelp forest diving. I am not a scientist. I am a scuba diver, but my love of diving and the paths that passion has put me on have allowed me to spend a whole lot of time in the kelp forests, especially around the southern Channel Islands, um, more than just about anyone I've ever met. In fact, looking at my logs, I have logged nearly 5,000 hours underwater in the kelp forests of Anacapa and Santa Cruz Islands. So I'm going to share a little bit today about what the last 3 decades of underwater photography have kind of meant to me. As an underwater photographer, I'm not a household name. I was never able to sustain myself or my family through photography, but in scuba diving and underwater photography circles, the kelp forest images that I've done have kind of become my signature. My images of the light shows created by the combination of sunlight and kelp have been used worldwide in both print and online publications. The kelp forests and the life they hold are not just special to me, as anyone with a little scientific or even environmental understanding knows. They're the building blocks that our entire world stands on, from food and commerce to the very air we breathe. Whether it's intrinsic or economical, the kelp forests have a value that no one should dispute. It's been my pleasure to spend so much time in them and through my photography, both learn about them and share what I've learned with others. The kelp forests are a place for exploration. Those of us who are lucky enough to get to do this get to see just how special they are. I'm going to presume that a lot of the people in here that are watching this today have spent some time in the kelp forest, either above it or inside it. But I'm going to talk with you a little bit about who I am and how I got where I am in the world of scuba diving and underwater photography. And then I'll talk a bit about my process for making compelling images in the kelp forest. And then finally, I'm going to share some stories that let me show you how I try to use the images that I create or make to preserve and protect the kelp forests. So my name is Douglas Klug, as Jess introduced me. I'm an underwater photographer, a scuba instructor, diving writer, and now a scuba diving guide. I use my wisdom that I've learned from my own personal experiences, the skills and equipment I've taught myself to use, and my own beliefs about the importance of the kelp forest to share this amazing world. I definitely am open to questions as I progress. I left some time at the end to answer them. So if you have questions, try to save them to the end and maybe we can roll through those. And I'm happy to roll back to specific slides or anything if somebody has a question about something I say. So I didn't start out as an underwater photographer. In fact, I was young when I started diving. I fell in love with it, and I literally built my life around my passion for diving and later for underwater photography. After learning to dive in high school, I started out the way a lot of divers do. I went to college near the coast where I could dive in my off-study time. And as I grew up in diving, I learned to hunt and gather in the kelp forests. Lobster, halibut, abalone. Yes, abalone, I ate a lot of it back in the day. They were the staples of my diet. And as a starving college student who could barely afford to buy food, I actually ate the way wealthy people ate. Take a close look. That's me, a much younger version of me on the left there. Take a look at the wall behind me. That wall is stacked with abalone shells. And those abalone shells were all abalone I caught while diving off of Santa Barbara and Goleta area beaches. I worked my way through college before there was Uber or Starbucks coffee or for part-time jobs. And instead, I worked in a dive shop. I eventually became a scuba instructor. I was at UCSB. That's where I was studying aquatic bio and environmental studies. And I eventually bought the dive shop I'd been working at. I thought that was a career path I wanted to go on. I tried to make a career out of the diving business, but it turned out to be a lot more difficult than I thought. And ultimately, I eventually closed the store. But those college years and the diving I did there kind of set me on a path. I met my wife there, and we became great dive buddies. Still married and still dive together. In 1992, we got married, and as a wedding present, someone gave us my wife and I, our first underwater camera was a Nikonus film camera. I know a lot of younger people don't even know what film is nowadays, but in the beginning, that's how we shot underwater. And since it involved diving, I started to play with it. It was technically given to both of us, but I eventually took kind of full control of that thing and started to use it. By then, I was a pretty accomplished and competent diver with more than 1,000 dives in the kelp forests, both off the beaches and around the islands. And so while learning the camera was a new skill, I wasn't burdened by the difficulties that a lot of divers have when they start out because they're still learning to dive when they pick up an underwater camera. In those early days, I would only shoot occasionally. I was still feeding myself with my diving a lot of the time. But because I was working at a dive shop, it put me in touch with some of the era's true underwater photography professionals. And I had some small successes, like this blue shark that's up on your screen right now. That was shot at Catalina Island while I was diving with a local Santa Barbara area photographer who would eventually go on to become one of the most well-known cinematographers in underwater film in the underwater film industry. Oops, sorry about that. For the next 10 years, I shot intermittently, and I frankly, I just got lucky. I had some successes. Images like this, a kelp forest sunburst, giant sea bass, and harbor seals dancing in the sun's rays, those became something I was known for. And those images got noticed. They got picked up and they were published by institutions such as the Monterey Bay Aquarium and the National Park Service. The three images that just kind of rolled across your screen display, those were all shot on 35 millimeter film. With that original Nikonus camera. I shot those during the late 90s and early 2000s. And obviously, those images have been digitized now for use in presentations like this. And it kind of started to snowball, especially the kelp stuff. Maybe I was a little bit unique in that I was one of the people that was regularly shooting out there. But I started to get some more recognition. My background was in diving, so I didn't have the type of kind of media contacts that would propel me onto front pages around the world. But I built a reputation for kind of stock photography. This allowed me to shoot what I wanted to shoot when I wanted, and then put the images I liked out for others to use. If you have ever worked in photo or print publication, there are kind of two types of work. Some photographers come up with a story, or they're given a story, assigned a story, and then they try to go out and they shoot those images that align with that story. Others, like me, I go out and I capture the image and then try to build a story around it. As I've done this, I've tried to use my education experience to make those stories accurate and entertaining. Ultimately, my images ended up in all sorts of uses, and you can see some of them here on your screen, from printed articles to internet news stories. I've had an image on a kayak paddle, wall of a gym, and even a preschool bathroom, believe it or not. Other people started using my images the same way I did, to create a visual representation of the stories they were trying to tell. As a photographer, I felt this was one of the best ways to spread knowledge and understanding about the kelp forest. Let me check in, Jess, if you can say everything's coming across, everybody can hear me okay?
Everything's great.
Perfect. Okay, I'll continue. The early successes I had with my kelp forest shooting kind of led me to realize that I might be able to continue down that path. The equipment was obviously getting better, and also I was starting to learn how to use it. Film cameras gave way to digital imaging, and modern digital cameras went into housings or protective underwater cases that allowed more control and access to modern camera settings. And I could use those features while I was shooting underwater. Strobes got better. I could use them to fill in the shadows, and there were better lenses that let me shoot closer and even wider than before. And in photography, when you're in the kelp forest, wide is king. This is the kind of stuff that you can capture with a wide angle lens on the right day with the right conditions. Wide angle lenses, when I shoot wide, you can be fisheye lenses, which yields a pleasing vignette or a rounding to the images, like this one that you see across the screen right here. Underwater, I really like this effect because it enhances the image. Alternatively, you can have a wide angle image that's considered rectilinear, that image keeps that lens keeps the image straight, and it really, really shows off the height of these majestic forests. So as that technology got better, the lenses got better, the cameras got better, I learned to apply it to what I call my work underwater. I started to employ new techniques like close focus, wide angle. And that became something I used to express and share what I saw in the kelp forest, because it's so multidimensional being in the kelp forest. I could use strobes, and strobes that were equipped with what's called TTL, or through the lens metering, allowed me to fill in the foreground shadows while shooting into the distant sun's rays, making shots like this. This was taken from an underwater cave at Anacapa Island, shooting up into the kelp forest just outside the cave. These became tools in my toolbox to make compelling underwater images that made the viewer actually feel what it was like to be there. And then sometimes I would even turn the camera sideways. I started shooting vertical portraits, not initially, but a vertical shot fit onto a magazine cover nicely. Somebody threw that out to me when I started shooting, and I've always remembered that. Prints kind of become dead, but in more recent years, that vertical orientation is very popular for social media use because it covers the screen on a phone. And it could even be used to display an exhibit at the National Aquarium in Baltimore. I started working with the constant motion created by the surge. Diving in the kelp forest is not like other places in the world. Everything moves all the time. And I found that I could take that to my advantage. I used continuous shooting settings so that even shots from the same position and in the same close sequence were different from one another. Cameras equipped with high-speed shooting allowed for transitional series of images like what just splashed across your screen. I'm going to change gears here and talk about something about snowflakes real quick, because they say that no two snowflakes are ever the same. And I kind of feel the same way when I'm diving in the kelp forest. With a constant motion, the changes in lighting, even if I'm completely still, there are no two shots that are ever the same. So these are kind of my own snowflake shots. But one of the things you have to understand about diving in the kelp forest, especially Anacapa and Santa Cruz Island, is it's not always perfect. I don't always have clear water and pristine conditions every time I dive. Sometimes the forest is dark and hazy. These conditions don't lend themselves to wide angle shooting. So when the conditions aren't favorable for shooting the kelp, for shooting wide angle, it becomes about getting close and shooting small. I can capture intense detail using macro or close-up lenses to give an incredible perspective on the kelp forest, something most people don't pay attention to. Macro images capture detail and reduce the need for clear water. I can basically shoot a shot like this on your screen in very low, like 2 to 3 foot visibility. All I have to have is kelp and the right equipment on my camera. The reduction of sunlight creates a different kind of image lit only by my strobes and the settings I've selected on the camera. Of course, the ocean's energy shapes the kelp for me just like it does with a wide angle shooting. So I can create those one of a kind images. I just do them on a close-up scale. And with macro shooting, the perfect geometry of the kelp forest itself, or the kelp itself, can make the image. Macro lens can also help me tell a story of the life within the kelp forest, including the miniature details of the creatures that live there. There are colorful nudibranchs and several species of kelpfish that can be found hiding within the intricate kelp holdfasts. Of course, all these tools and photography skills won't come together without good diving skills. Shooting in the kelp forest requires exceptional diving skills because it's a three-dimensional medium that's in constant motion around me. Though that's not me in the picture, I was able to shoot that image of a friend that shows the medium we often work in. This is pretty standard for us diving. Kelp all around us. Now, obviously, the still image is just that, But consider that all of that kelp is moving all the time and you're getting tangled in it. It's wrapping up around your camera and you're trying to get the right angle on whatever critter or scene you're trying to capture. Balance, control over buoyancy, and of course, the ability to use the equipment at the right time and the right place all come into play. And if I do it right, what I really love is to use those skills and tools to show the kelp forest and the changes I see in it as I dive in them year after year. Whether it's a blue rockfish like this hovering above the reef, or marine mammals like this young California sea lion that'll hopefully grow and thrive in the kelp forest. I like to think that my experiences over the last 35 years have helped me do the same. I try to share these views with others through my photography. And by sharing a world that so few encounter, I hope I can create the desire to preserve. Now I'm going to rip off somebody else's quote here. He's undoubtedly the most famous ocean explorer, responsible for exposing more of the underwater world to the masses than anyone. But Jacques Cousteau's quote on this particular subject has ultimately stood the test of time. The ability to expose the kelp forest to those who might not otherwise see this world became part of my personal plan. I'm just one person, but sometimes images can carry a louder voice than words. My passion for diving and my abilities as a diving leader have given me new opportunities to share and educate. Over the last several decades, there's been a trend in recreational scuba that's led to divers who are, I don't know, you could say less comfortable diving on their own and prefer to enter the water with a dive leader. Dive guiding has become commonplace around the world, but it wasn't always the case here in Southern California until recently. It's here now, and this allows dive leaders like myself to give divers who might just not be comfortable diving in the kelp forest by themselves a firsthand experience to see what it's like with a professional guide. So I want to take a minute and I want to talk about some of those changes that I've witnessed and how I've been able to share them in a way that promotes both preservation and protection of the kelp forests. To do that, you have to understand a little bit about how I access these areas. So I don't have a boat. The Channel Islands, best case scenario, sit about 13 miles off the coast of Ventura County. So it's not really swimmable. So I dive off the recreational boats that serve the Channel Islands. And though the number is dwindling, there are still some boats that get us out there. When the diving's good at a particular spot, the captains will usually remember that. And it's not uncommon to return to the same sites, a couple of days later or a week later, as long as the divers are happy. This was kind of the case between November of 2020 and early January of 2021. So maybe about a 3-month period when San Pedro Point at the eastern end of Santa Cruz Island suddenly bloomed into a rich and thriving kelp forest. Prior to those months, there was some kelp there. It had some small kelp patches, but it was mostly barren rock and sand. It wasn't a great dive. Now, when they visit these areas, the recreational boats use anchors, but they also use GPS systems. So they almost always anchor within a few feet, like within a meter or two of the same spot. In fact, often on the bottom, you can see, the areas where the anchors have been dropped over and over and over, which in a sense is good because they're not destroying the entire rock bottom. They're just dropping on the same rock every single time. This process that they use kind of allows me to orient myself during return visits and often capture the same views time after time. So this San Pedro Point story starts with California state marine fish. He's probably the most iconic fish of the kelp forest. It's the Garibaldi. The images that I'm showing you now in the next series I'm going to show you were shot between November of 2020 and January of 2021 at San Pedro Point. The kelp forest in that area was super thick and healthy. Those months are often the best months to visit the Channel Islands for me because the water isn't as warm as summertime, but the marine layer is dissipated by then. And if there aren't any storms, the water is still clear. The combination of sunlight, clean water, and healthy kelp forest make for some incredible imaging opportunities. The densest portion of the forest was shallow, sometimes only 15 or 20 feet of water. But there was a whole mess of schooling Garibaldi in there, all kind of late phase juveniles. just losing some of them just had a little bit of fringe of blue on their fins, but the majority, they had all lost their spots, and they were kind of hanging out and schooling up in areas. And it really made for a great foreground of these kelp forests because I had these bright orange fish. I truly counted myself lucky to visit that place a number of times and had the opportunity to shoot some images. Even the forest itself, as it swayed with the surge, made for just stunning images. While I worked, I found myself pausing between the shots just to take it all in and wondering about the change, what caused it, or how 6 months earlier it was really a barren reef, and then the kelp just exploded. My experiences are more photography. Like when I get there, I take notes about it. And I'm not using any scientific process to gather any information. So I can only say that the kelp forests around the parts of the Channel Islands I routinely visit have been largely spared from the onslaught of purple sea urchins that have affected other parts of the state with the disappearance of the sunflower sea star. As most of you probably know, was a major predator on the urchins. Here, in this picture, and this was one of those San Pedro Point pictures from that period, the urchins are all nestled tightly within the rocks. They're not out cruising around. And my understanding, what I believe, is that a healthy forest provides enough loose kelp fragments that the urchins really don't have to leave the protection of the reef to search for food. And even if you're an urchin, there's reasons to stay hidden in a healthy kelp forest. See, down here we have this great fish. It's called a sheephead. The sheephead is a major urchin predator, and they use their big teeth to dislodge urchins and crush them up. It makes up a pretty big portion of the adult sheephead diet. We also have spiny lobsters. Spiny lobsters will prey on smaller urchins. They have a hard exoskeleton, so they're kind of resistant to the urchin spines, and they have really hard mandibles that they use to crush the urchins up. It's pretty well known that the sunflower sea stars, were a significant urchin predator. But when they vanished around the Channel Islands as well. North of California's Point Conception, there really aren't any spiny lobsters. Maybe a couple make their way up there from time to time, but it's definitely a reduced population, as is the sheephead. So I feel like the fact that both of these natural urchin predators are still around, especially in the Channel Islands, where I'm diving, in the islands of Anacapa and Santa Cruz, are limiting that grazing impact on the urchins and giving us the ability to have kind of healthy kelp forests still standing. And no, for anyone who's got that question forming in the back of their mind, that San Pedro Point area is not part of any marine protected area or an MPA. It's open to both spearfishing and collection and or trapping of lobsters. The nearest MPA is about 2 miles away from San Pedro Point. It's at Scorpion Anchorage. The kelp forest around San Pedro Point flourished despite hunting, fishing, trapping pressure from divers and boaters. Oops, sorry about that. Didn't quite mean to do that yet. So there are other factors that affect the kelp forest, and because I shoot the forest so much, I often get inquiries from photographers about where to go to get that shot. My answer is usually an explanation that the kelp forests around the islands, at least where I dive, they kind of wax and wane with the seasons and the years. What yielded a memorable experience recently might be a totally different underwater environment a few months later. And as a reminder, all these images at San Pedro Point I've been showing you, they were between November of 2020 and January of 2021. Flash forward a year. Here's the same San Pedro Point reef. This is from February of 2022. These shots were taken from a spot within a few meters. So, I mean, I knew where the boat had been anchoring in the past, and it dropped the anchor in virtually the same spot. They were taken within a few meters of where I took all those 2020 shots and early 2021 shots. At the same angle, same direction, shooting up into the sun. And note now the urchins are kind of out and about. They're not wedged into those cracks and crevices anymore. There's a whole lot more of them. And I think that's because less forest means less loose kelp. And that means that those guys got to get out and move around. You can also note there's a dramatic reduction in canopy. The kelp that was there, some of it barely reaching the surface. What little kelp was left was thin and sparse. There were some Garibaldi there, but not in the numbers I had seen the previous year. So a quick internet search is all it takes to get a reminder about the significant storm and weather events that struck the area between late January 2021, so a couple of weeks after I got those last shots that I showed you, and January of 2022. There were a bunch of them. There was a couple of atmospheric rivers in January, and then at the end of the year, and then there was that tsunami that generated some big swell. So when I talk about the waxing and waning of these kelp forests, what I've seen is it's usually storm related. After events such as these, the kelps piled up high on those rocky beaches around those islands. As a reminder, both these images were from San Pedro Point, and they were about 14 months apart from each other, really shot in virtually the same direction. You can see both of those are shooting straight into the sun about the same time of the day. So sadly, San Pedro Point at the eastern end of Santa Cruz Island has remained largely an urchin barren since then. I returned a number of times. This is a snip from my dive log where you can see the dates. And I've been back as recently as April of this year. And the kelp just still hasn't come back. Weather-wise, over the past few years, Southern California has experienced a long-duration, powerful south swell that adversely affects the south-facing sides of the islands. Well, you can see right there, that's where San Pedro Point is, and the portion that we dive is that south-facing portion of the island. So it's just been getting pounded by this onslaught of strong south swell, and I believe that south swell has impacted the ability of the kelp forest to reestablish itself to what it was. And for those of you who are curious about where that nearby MPA was, you can see it up there at the kind of center top of the screen on the northern portion of Santa Cruz Island. There's Scorpion Anchorage, and that area is where the nearest MPA is. It's about 2 miles from San Pedro Point. So I always try to end with a little bit of good news, and that even though the underwater forests around San Pedro Point haven't returned, other areas around the Channel Islands retain their healthy kelp forests with the same biodiversity we've come to expect. In some cases, dive sites that didn't have large forests now have them. And through my photography, I hope to share this message about the shifting rise and fall of the kelp forests around the Channel Islands. One big storm can wipe out an entire section of forest, but with the care and protection, it can return, or if it doesn't, can be replaced by a forest on another reef nearby. In these areas, the Garibaldi are still there. They're still nesting happily. And despite the disappointing loss of kelp forests at San Pedro Point, there are other sections of these islands where the kelp forest still thrives. This is a section of reef at Cathedral Cove on Anacapa Island. And Cathedral Cove is part of the original Anacapa Island Marine Protected Area. I love it when I can visit this spot because it's almost always, as long as it's clear, it's always like this because the visibility or the kelp forest is super healthy. Around the northern Channel Islands, there's a network of MPAs that have been established. That's a source of public debate between scientists and fishermen. I'm not going to get into it because I really just like to get into the portions where it's healthy and enjoy that kelp forest. Here's Cathedral Cove in all of its underwater splendor. Nobody disputes the success of these areas that are largely protected from human impacts. Anyone who's looking at this image that understands what a healthy kelp forest should look like knows that overhead canopy, that thick overhead canopy and the thick coils of kelp stipes there on the left, that means that this is a solid, well-established kelp forest. So when we talk about the MPAs, if you're not familiar with them, that whole red area, that is the long-standing reserve, and that area of Landing Cove that you can see there on the right portion of that image, that's been a marine protected area for over 50 years. So it's well established. Anacapa Island also has this other cool special closure area just to the left of the red or orange area. That special closure area is designated no boat traffic for 10 months out of the year. That area was closed because of the brown pelican fledglings in there. We call it the Pelican Reserve. It's on the island's north side, and because it's on the north side, it doesn't get the pounding from that south facing, from that strong south swell. So those areas are really, really healthy. It also has no traffic at all from divers 10 months out of the year. It is open from November 1st to December 31st. That does encompass lobster season. So once it opens, there's a bunch of traps in there and a bunch of divers that do work that area. So it does get some pressure, but divers who are lucky enough to visit it during the open time can be treated to an amazing experience. It is truly a healthy kelp forest, despite the fishing pressure that it does get. During November and December, the experience for visitors to the kelp forest can be breathtaking, like this view of, and this was taken during a November dive in the Pelican Reserve. This one too. The Pelican Reserve's reefs are healthy and they're filled with life. Gorgonians, obviously the Garibaldi, all sorts of encrusting animals, and a nice kelp canopy in the background. So I don't have any doubt that these forests that I visit will continue to come and go from one location to another as I continue to dive them in the future. By showing off what these forests can be, and in some cases, I hope that people will continue to work at maintaining healthy ocean conditions and a network of MPAs so the next generation of kelp forest can return when one is lost somewhere. For me, I hope that I can keep looking up at the sky through the clear kelp, or through the kelp and the clear water, seeing the sunshine up there occasionally, watching the sunlight as it plays through the kelp forest, watching the schooling fish. These are juvenile blacksmith clouds of them this time of year, and capturing images that show this underwater world. I'll probably just keep following these fish into the kelp forest. So that's me. Thanks so much for your time. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation, and I'm happy to open it up to questions if anybody has any. Here's my contact information, which I'll leave them up there on the screen. If you're too embarrassed to ask and want to send me an email with the question, or I'm happy to do that too. And I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen so we can all see each other if anybody has any questions.